Hi, fantasy readers. This is Karyne Norton, your fellow bookbinger, and you are listening to the Finding Fantasy Reads podcast, where you can test out a new fantasy story every single week to find your next favorite author. We're in the middle of our Fantasy Retelling Month, with an audiobook giveaway and 4 fantasy retellings. So far, we've had a Sleeping Beauty retelling, a Peter Pan retelling, and now we're starting a Cinderella retelling that will carry us through the next week. I'm always impressed at authors' abilities to find new ways to spin old stories. There are hundreds of Cinderella retellings. We've even had 1 or 2 others on the podcast, but they all feel different. This one is written by Sarah Carlisle, a homeschooling mom of 6 kids who got her start in writing Jane Austen variations, her other love, under the pen name Sarah Courtney. The novels in her first series, Enchanted Tales of Tyr, are each based on a fairy tale on the southern continent, and she'll be jumping to the northern continent for her second series of original fantasy novels. Those of you who've been listening for a while know that I try really hard to keep each episode between 30 and 60 minutes so that it's consistent for you. But you'll also notice that this episode is well over an hour, and the next one will be as well. And I'm not going to apologize for that. When I picked this story, it was because I knew it was amazing and I didn't really pay attention to how long it was. So, you get a little extra helping of Finding Fantasy Reads these next 2 weeks. Stick around to the end or check out today's show notes to see where you can find more from the author, as well as how to enter our fantasy retelling audiobook giveaway. For now, please enjoy Unmasked, Part 1 by Sarah Carlisle. Chapter 1. Sowell jolted awake at the sound of a clatter at his window. He grinned. It had been a long time since he had been awakened at stones thrown at the glass, and surprisingly, he found he had missed it. Unlocking his window, he thrust it open. Shining eyes peered at him from the side, where his best friend Alary clung to the wrought iron framework around his window. "You know, I had thought we were a bit old for this," he said as he grasped her elbow and helped her through the opening. "Just because everyone else thinks we've grown out of childish shenanigans doesn't mean we need to follow expectations," she said, landing on her knees in front of the window. Sowell put his hands on his hips. "Given that we are now old enough for this to be considered something of a scandal, why are you here?" Alary sighed. "My parents." Wincing, Sowell nodded. Neither of Alary's parents had ever seemed to care about her beyond what she could do for them. They had been thrilled when she and Sowell had become friends as children, and they used their relationship to worm themselves into every palace function and to develop business relationships among the highest nobles. Alary's father was an earl, but he also owned several ships and trading caravans, and was heavily involved in the markets of several different countries across the continent. "What are they doing now?" He gestured towards the sitting room that bordered his bedchamber. Nobody was likely to come in this late at night, but it still felt a little odd to be talking to a girl in his bedroom. Alary followed him and sank into one of the soft armchairs as soon as they reached the sitting room. "They're sending me to Karnovka," she said flatly, not meeting his eye. "They what?" He froze in place. "For how long?" "Permanently." She bit her lip. "They made some sort of major trading deal with the king of Karnovka to let our caravans trade without paying tariffs and with the protection of his crown." The king of Karnovka had become increasingly reckless in the past few years. Tariffs had been rising for years, no small thing when the country was at the hub of the continent and trading routes were the basis of their economy. Taxes for residents were ruinously high. Anybody who protested any of the crown's activities disappeared, often along with their entire family. The country teetered on the edge of disaster. "They agreed to send me to be part of his court, as a gesture of goodwill," Alary said bitterly. "I protested. You know they say no pretty girl is safe in his court. And? Aleri paused for a long moment, and he began to regret asking. They don't care, she said at last. They said that I should stay in his good graces, no matter what it took, for the good of their trade. Sawell reached between their chairs to take Aleri's hand. We won't let that happen. Your parents can't stop it. There's nothing illegal about sending your daughter to another country's court. It's done all the time. And even if you could convince your father to intercede, if the king of Karnovka caught word that the king of Kummer had interfered with the deal he made with my parents, it would be an international scandal. Sawell nodded slowly. So you're running away. Is that less of a scandal, though? Aleri shrugged. At least then everybody can blame me, and I won't be there to be punished. It won't hurt you. He squeezed her hand. I'm not worried about whether it will hurt me. But where will you go? I don't know. Her eyes caught on his miniature city, and her face lit up. You still have it, she exclaimed, leaning over the nearest wall. Unlike when his brothers visited, Sawell could trust her not to disturb any of the tiny buildings or the elaborate battle scene at one end. Is it the battle for the strait? She asked, gesturing towards the soldiers in ancient Cimmerian and Ashestunian garb brandishing spears as they ran towards the approaching enemy forces. Wooden stockade fences around tiny forts marked the edge of the defensive zones. Sawell nodded. I tried to make the Ashestunian soldiers distinct from the Cimmerian with their tunic design, and see how their shields are round, while ours are more ovular. This tiny farm is my favorite. Aleri leaned closer to a farm near the battle site. The farthest fields were on fire, made with colored tissue for the flames and dyed plant fluff to make smoke. He was rather proud of the effect, but Aleri was looking at the intact fields, with their neatly planted rows. How did you make these look just like real plants? Evergreen needles. They last longer than other plants. But you're changing the subject, Aleri. She shot him a quick look before turning back to the miniatures, but it was enough to show the tears in her eyes. She didn't have a plan, just desperation. And that made it all the more likely that she would be caught and forced to follow her parents' design after all. How could he bear to lose her? Aleri had been his best friend for as long as he could remember. Even if helping her escape to Rizkra or find work as a baker's assistant would save her, he would never see her again. Unless... You'll need a job. She nodded, straightening up and throwing her shoulders back. Of course, I'm prepared to work. As an earl's daughter, she had not been required to do a great deal herself. She would be hopeless in the kitchen, or doing laundry or milking cows. But Aleri's governess had been very strict and required her to make her own bed tight and neat, clean her own room, dust, and otherwise keep her things tidy. He remembered her endless complaints about it over the years, but perhaps it would serve her well now. You could be an upstairs maid. As Aleri's face turned pensive, he said, Here, at the palace. Are you mad? She hissed. I would be recognized. I don't think so. It isn't as if the palace staff would see you so very often, especially the maids. You would look different in a maid's uniform, too, and with a maid's cap. And I would only have to hide until my birthday, Aleri said slowly. Once I am of age, they cannot force me to go. I would not dare return to their house for fear they would simply stuff me into a carriage. But the risk would be less. You'll do it? She nodded. But if I'm recognized, then you'll flee, and I'll go with you. When she opened her mouth to protest, he held up a hand. Only until you are safe. Deal? Fine. But she grinned at him. Can I sleep on your sofa then? She gestured towards the rather stiff sofa that dominated one wall of his sitting room. No way. When her face fell, he amended with a wink. You get the bed. There's no way I'm letting a lady take the sofa while I take the bed, even if said lady is only you. She threw a sofa pillow at him on her way to the bedroom. Alary smoothed her maid uniform and clasped her hands behind her back as she waited for the head maid to notice her in the line of girls who stood before her. She stifled a yawn as she waited. She had spent yesterday hiding in the folly, a marble monstrosity in the garden that was meant to resemble an ancient Cimmerian temple, but was no more than a few 100 years old, while Sowell worked his magic to find her a position. And while she was grateful, she wished it hadn't been a position that started hours before sunrise. Owenna, Deerin, Saris, you will all start with the Great Hall and the throne room, and then the ambassadors' quarters. Alice, Lowry, and the other Owenna, you'll start with the parlors and the private sitting room, then move on to the family wing. Her eyes landed on Alary. And you, new maid, you are Eva? Alary blinked. Had Saul given them a false name for her? It made sense, but it was just like him to forget to tell her. Yes. I don't know why they assigned you here when there were other much more qualified applicants. Her frown deepened. Like my cousin, Margid. Alary winced. That did not bode well. I am Nesta, head upstairs maid. We do the bedrooms and the public rooms on the main floor. You'll start with the fireplace grates, while Teolip does the cleaning and dusting. Alary grimaced. I must admit that I have never done grates before, although I do have a great deal of practice with beds and dusting and cleaning stains. A light came into Nesta's eyes. Never done the grates, she purred. Well, then, that will be the first thing you must learn. All the girls start with the fireplace grates. In fact, to make sure you are getting the practice you need, you will do all the grates. After all, they say practice makes perfect. Is that usually a job of a housemaid? She had thought scullery maids usually did that task. Perhaps that was only because her parents' household was far smaller than the palace. The head housemaid's eyes gleamed. Is it too much for you? Because we do have other interested applicants for this position. No. Alary took a deep breath. It was simply unexpected, but I would be happy to clean the grates. Excellent. Teolip? Nesta turned to the other maid, who had been waiting patiently. Eva will do the grates, so leave those and do the other work. Go along with the other Owenna, and the two of you will work together. Yes, ma'am. Teolip curtsied and left the room. Now, Nesta nodded towards the fireplace. You'll clean this fireplace under my supervision. Then you'll go on to do the rest. And if you do a poor job, I'll add cleaning the chamber pots to your duties. She looked as if she wished she had saved that job for Alary as well. Roll up the hearth rug first and put it in the servants' passage. Daffyd comes and collects them all to be shaken outdoors and beaten as necessary. Put out canvas in front of the fireplace while you are working. Alary dutifully rolled up the hearth rug and hefted it up. It was heavier than she realized, though, and she almost dropped it. A cloud of ash burst into the air from the end that hit the floor, and she winced. Nesta looked both furious and triumphant. You'll have to sweep and scrub the floor there to get all the ash up. Alary nodded mutely. Get on with it, then. Once she had obeyed Nesta's barked instructions for cleaning the floor and raking and sweeping up the ashes, it was time to oil the grate. The head maid gave no further instructions, so Alary examined the cleaning shelves. One bottle was labeled oil, so she picked it up. No, Nesta barked, looking delighted. That is oil for polishing wood. What are you thinking, girl? Biting her tongue, Alary chose a different bottle also labeled oil, and Nesta nodded curtly. Was it better to make a few mistakes so that Nesta could enjoy feeling superior and come to resent Aleri less? Or was it better to do her best so that nobody would have reason to end her employment? She followed Nesta's instructions as carefully as she could for oiling and scouring the grate and brushing it with black lead. This was going to be a dirty job. How many fireplaces did the palace have? She had never considered it, but there must be at least 50. Was it even possible to do all of this every day to every fireplace? The hearths must be scrubbed once a week with soap and water and dried with a rag. You'll need to find some way to keep track which you've done each day so that they each get the full treatment once a week. Nesta's eyes had been narrowed since the beginning of the instructions, but now they were practically a squint. I suppose you don't know how to read and write. I do, Aleri assured her. Doubt hit her in the next moment. Would a housemaid normally know how to read and write? Had she given herself away? The head maid's eyebrows rose. Do you? Her voice dripped with skepticism. Well, then you might consider taking notes at the end of the day. Now you know how to clean. Can you light a fire? Yes. That was the one part of this that Aleri felt confident in, as she had watched as it was done many times and even done it herself a few, although she was far clumsier at it than most servants would be. Would she remember all the rest of these steps, though, and in their order? Then I have my own work to get back to. I've wasted enough time training you on simple tasks. You'll do the public rooms now, before any of the royals or their guests wake for the morning. You will use the servants' stairs and stay out of sight. Aleri nodded. The Great Hall will be in use earliest, so do that first. The family sitting room and the parlors will not be needed so early, so you'll save those for the end. By the time you're done there, the bedchambers will be vacant, so you'll start on those. Always knock first on bedchambers, and if any are still occupied, take note to come back later. Am I the only one who will be cleaning all the grates? Aleri asked cautiously. The head housemaid gave her a tight smile. They all need clean fireplaces. I can't do every fireplace in the palace in a single day. Well, certainly not if you're standing here protesting to me. The head maid smiled. I suppose you had better get to it. Aleri bit back her retort. She needed this job. At least, she needed it for now. In 5 months, she would reach the age of majority. And then her parents wouldn't be able to send her to Karnovka without her agreement. 5 months of hiding as a maid. It couldn't be that hard. Saul knew better than to look around to see if anyone was watching him. It was a dead giveaway that one was doing something secretive. And with 5 younger brothers, looking as if you had a secret meant the end of your secret. He walked casually past the folly, kicking a stick and even stopping to pick up an interesting rock. Once the folly blocked him from sight from the palace windows, he stepped inside. Aleri was already there, sitting down rather inelegantly against one of the columns. You look tired, he said, dropping onto his haunches next to her. How is it going? She shrugged. Well enough. Nobody recognized me. He grinned. I knew it. People are too easily influenced by clothing and other cues. I don't know. She leaned forward to peek out of the folly. Meeting out here might be foolish. If anybody would recognize me, even in a maid's apron, it would be the gardeners. We got up to a little too much mischief on the palace grounds to be entirely forgotten. He huffed a laugh. Too true. But that's why I chose dusk as the best time to meet. The gardeners are done for the day, and the royals and courtiers have all gone to dress for dinner, so there isn't anybody around to notice us. And you're finished for the day as well, aren't you? They can't have you cleaning bedchambers now. She hesitated. No. What's wrong? Narrowing his eyes, he examined her. She looked exhausted. I suppose cleaning all day is a lot more work than cleaning one's own rooms. Alary gave him a weak smile and nodded, but he couldn't help worrying. She didn't look well. Maybe we should come up with another plan. He would hate to lose his friend if she had to move to another part of the country, or another country entirely. But it wouldn't be so far if she found a place in Rizkra or Ashendune, especially if it was just over the border. And maybe once she had turned 21, she could return. No, Alary said quickly, straightening her back. I am well. It is only for another 5 months or so. I will be well. He caught her hand in his. You are certain? He couldn't read her face as she looked down at his hand, but after a moment, she squeezed it. Sawal's eyes dropped to their hands, and then he caught sight of something just beyond. He chuckled. Were you making little fairy houses while you waited for me? He asked. A tiny house of stones leaned against the column, a neat little thatch on top protecting its minuscule inhabitants from the weather inside the folly. Nearby was a little circle of stones with a roof raised above it, a well. Alary crouched over the little house, adjusting a stone that had shifted out of place. I miss building them. I couldn't bring mine with me, but I couldn't bear to leave them for my parents to destroy. So I hid them in the woods, not far from the house. Nature will destroy them eventually, but I won't mind that half so much. Maybe we should mount an expedition to rescue them. Sawal was only half joking. He would be happy to lead a few of his brothers to sneak through her parents' estate and take her things back. Maybe send her parents on the next caravan to Karnovka while they were at it. Alary looked up at him, eyes sparkling, and a warmth filled Sawal's chest. It felt good to see Alary happy again, and she would be safe here at the palace. Safe with him. Chapter 2. I saw you, you know. Alary, startled, almost tumbled backwards from her crouch. Thankfully, the bucket of ashes was safe, but her heart was still pounding as she twisted to see who had addressed her. It was the head housemaid, Nesta. Saw me? Alary asked, not sure what the protocol was here. Should she stand since she was being addressed by her superior? Continue to work to show that she was diligent? She settled for giving the head maid her full attention without standing. Saw you go into the folly. Maids aren't allowed there, you know. Alary bit her lip. It hadn't occurred to her that anybody would particularly notice or care where she went. They never had before. But that was when she was Lady Alary, daughter of the Earl of Royder, welcome visitor to the palace. I had wanted to take a look. I didn't realize it was off bounds. I will stay out in the future. Housemaids do not have permission to wander the palace gardens. Nesta's eyes were narrowed as she looked down on Alary. I apologize. Nesta's eyes were still burning into hers, and Alary looked down at her work. See that you do, Nesta said at last. And hurry up with that grate. Don't think I didn't notice several grates unfinished yesterday. That won't happen again. You'll finish them all, even if it means returning to them after dinner and working half the night. Taking a deep breath, Alary kept her reply to a meek, Yes, Nesta. Alary waited until the head maid left before gritting her teeth and returning to the grate. She had worked hard and steadily all day yesterday, but cleaning every grate in the palace was an impossible task. She had stuck to the areas she was told at the right times, the downstairs rooms before anyone was awake, the bedrooms once people were out of them, and had taken note of which grates she had not been able to get to. Today, she had started with those grates first. But it would take at least an additional hour or two if she was to finish all of the grates every day. Not to mention that avoiding the palace gardens was going to be a problem. Sawal expected to see her at the end of her workday. What would he think if she never came? Maybe she could find a way to accidentally run into him during the day and let him know. As she finished cleaning the grate and moved on to the next, she considered, what was a time of day when she could be reliably sure where he would be, and that she could get him alone? He would eat meals on time, of course, but that would hardly be the ideal time to speak with him. Even going in and out of the great hall, he would usually be accompanied by a sibling or two. Some, like Marin or Dewey or Podrick, would probably keep the secret. But if Cadwallon or Artur found out, everybody would. And even Rain might feel honor-bound to tell his father. The best time, in fact, might be when he intended to meet her anyway. Would he go back to his rooms first, or leave directly from where he was? Regardless, he would probably leave from the entrance that overlooked the gardens, so if she waited just inside, she might be able to get his attention. Alary had never watched the time so carefully as she did that day. Some of the rooms she entered had clocks, and she checked them diligently. When they didn't, she made sure to take the occasional detour to find one, whenever she thought she might be nearing the end of the day. After she had cleaned the last grate she could afford to, and taken note of which ones she had missed, she rushed downstairs to empty her last pail of ashes, then cleaned her hands and arms and put on a fresh apron. A glance at the shiny bottom of a pan hanging near the sink made her gasp, and she returned to the sink to wash the soot off her face. Presentable at last, she grabbed a dust rag and hurried to the back entrance of the palace nearest the gardens. The little decorative table and vase had never received such a thorough cleaning as the one they received that day, but finally, out of the corner of her eye, she saw Sowell approaching, alone. Thank goodness. "Sowell," she hissed, then quickly turned back to the table she was dusting. To his credit, Sowell stopped immediately. "Oh, drat," he said loudly, before bending down over his boot as if to fix the lace. "What is going on?" he asked softly, his voice deep and low. "The head maid saw me go into the palace gardens yesterday, and warned me off today." Sowell's head whipped towards hers, but only for a moment before it was back on his boot. "Does that matter?" "Yes, she is my supervisor here, and it will hardly look good if I disobey her orders. Besides, she's right. A typical housemaid wouldn't be in the formal gardens. In the kitchen gardens, certainly, but not near the folly." Sowell pulled at the laces as if they were knotted. "You may have a point. What about in the woods, by the pond? If you approach from the kitchen gardens as if you were picking nettles for tea, nobody ought to notice anything, and the woods are dense enough to hide you once you've gone in deep enough." Alary hid a grin. "Just like the old days, eh? Think we'll find a fairy?" "Just think of it as outwitting an ogre." Sowell stood up. "Try. If you can't get there, we'll try again tomorrow. And if you still can't manage it, I'll find you. I won't leave you to do this all alone. I promise, Alary." And then he was gone, walking out the door with his long strides. The way to the woods through the kitchen gardens was longer, but Alary didn't mind. Her mind, as she trotted down the hallway towards the kitchen, was on Sowell's last words. "I won't leave you to do this all alone. I promise." Sowell had only ever been her friend, her playmate. But now there was something comforting, almost protective about his words. And oddly, she felt her cheeks warm. Sowell grimaced as he wrestled the last branch between two others, twisting a vine to hold it in place. At last he was able to step back and admire his handiwork. Wiping his forehead with his shirt, he grinned. The hut had turned out surprisingly well. His pocket knife had been large enough to help him cut a collection of branches, and he had spent an hour collecting others from the undergrowth throughout the woods, using strong vines that wrapped around the trees to weave the branches into shape. The result was a hut with solid branch walls, 2 window openings, and an opening for the door. He would weave grass or vines later to make mats that could be rolled up above the openings and tied when they wanted the windows and doors open, or allowed to drop down when they wanted them closed. The roof was a simple thatch supported by a framework of branches. Sowell! He beamed at hearing the awe in Alari's voice. She had good timing. If she'd come half an hour ago, when the front wall had partially collapsed and he had been struggling to fix it without the rest collapsing around him, it wouldn't have been nearly so impressive. Like it? He asked. I love it. She stepped forward and reached out a hand to touch a vine hanging near the door. It's perfect. I figured since we intend to meet here regularly, it might be nice to have a little spot to help stay out of sight. While the hut would clearly appear man-made up close, the undergrowth was heavy enough nearby that it couldn't be seen until one was very near. O'Larry's maid uniform, and the clothes he was required to wear most days, would stand out far less if they could duck inside the little hut. It won't collapse if I go inside, will it? O'Larry's voice was warm with amusement. Not this time. Sowell followed her in. There wasn't a great deal of space inside, but enough. They could each have lain down side by side, but they sat across from each other instead, knees tucked to chests, just as they had done so many times as children. I'm pretty sure you said that the last time when you built us that magical cottage that would make us invisible to ogres, O'Larry reminded him. Sowell groaned. I'm 20 now. What was I then, 10, 12? I like to think I've learned a thing or two about building huts in the meantime. I don't know. I think you spent a lot more time building huts back then. Don't you spend most of your day in council meetings and the like now? Don't remind me. Sowell leaned his head back, gingerly, as he didn't want to prove O'Larry right about the sturdiness, or lack thereof, of the hut, and sighed. I've barely had time to escape into these woods in years. I don't think I realized just how little I've been out here. Last time was with me, she said softly. The last time I visited before my presentation at court. He nodded slowly. Yes. Well, we didn't make it past the edge of the woods then. Your parents were watching too closely. Always concerned with my reputation. O'Larry shook her head, making her hair puff out of the little buns she wore it in. She chuckled suddenly. Or perhaps they were worried that I would fall in the pond again. Do you remember that time you pushed me? For the last time, I didn't push you. You pushed me. And then, of course, I pushed you back, and that's when you fell in. Excuse me, I'm pretty sure I heard an I pushed you in that story, regardless of provocation. I think I rather enjoyed it, though, as it was a hot day and it was stifling in that dress. Sowell murmured his agreement. His sister Marin had always worn slimmer dresses with light colors during the summer. Well, she had until this summer, he supposed. Their new stepmother, Queen Shined, was very strict about Marin's dress now that she was on the verge of her court presentation. But even when she was very young, O'Larry's parents had always dressed her very formally and expensively, even for day dresses. Quite a few of those dresses had been ditched in a good hiding place near the edge of the woods before their childhood adventures as children. Her underdresses were still modest, and they allowed a lot more freedom of movement. He had wondered from time to time if her family's laundry maids ever wondered why her underdresses were always so much dirtier than her gowns. But given that underdresses could be washed more easily, he supposed they had little cause to complain. It is too bad you didn't find any mermaids while you took your swim. O'Larry rested her chin on one of her knees. No fairies either. And you never killed an ogre, no matter how much running about you did with that spear you carved. She sighed deeply. I suppose there's little enough magic in the world after all, no matter how much we liked to imagine there was then. He kicked her ankle a little with the tip of his foot. Don't say that. I'm determined to keep you safe from 2 ogres, as it turns out. My hero. The words should have sounded sarcastic, But Alari's brown eyes were serious as they met his, and her tone was solemn. His face heated, and he looked away. How long did this hut take you? Sawell recognized Alari's attempt to change the subject, but he didn't object. Hours, he admitted. I thought at first to make us a treehouse. It would be less visible and a far better hiding place, especially if your position as a maid gets discovered, and we need to hide you elsewhere. But I would need tools to make a house safe up there, and it would be a disaster if I were observed carrying tools into the woods. So ultimately, I decided it wasn't worth the risk. She nodded. If I was caught as a maid anyway, they would be suspicious about you already. Hiding in the woods wouldn't last long. Although I'm surprised that you couldn't get away with carrying tools around. Don't you use them all the time for your miniature cities? Not giant saws or bags of nails, he exclaimed. Ah, true. She paused. Do you think anyone will be suspicious about you being away so long? Not if I don't do it for hours every day. I have a tendency to slip off to work on my miniatures, as you said. I can spare an hour a day easily. It's one of the benefits of being the second son. Poor Rain. I'm not sure he even gets an hour. Doesn't he need a little time to rest? Sawell shrugged. Ever since Father made Rain come back from Roscra and break off his engagement, he's been constantly busy. I don't know if Father is keeping him busy so he won't have time to think about it, or if Rain is throwing himself into his work on purpose. But he leaned forward. Honestly, I think his heart is broken. Alari's eyes widened. Truly? Or are you just having me on? Rain in love? It doesn't seem possible, does it? Sawell chuckled. He never confided in me about it, but we were pretty close before that. He was touring Roscra, you know, my mother was the king's cousin, and became engaged to some girl there. And then Father became very angry, made him break it off, and brought him back here. He's been solemn and sort of sullen ever since. I don't know if he was in love or if he's angry because the girl was taking advantage of him, but he hasn't been the same since. Poor Rain. Alari looked down at her feet, her face unreadable. Did your father want him to marry a princess, not a commoner? Sawell shrugged. Maybe. Probably not Princess Katya, since she's the heir to the Veldamese throne, and Princess Sawin of Ashesdoon is too young for him. But Slanna has 5 princesses, and the older ones are the right age. And Princess Lucia of Cadera could be a possibility in a year or two. Alari nodded, but there was still something odd about her expression. What's wrong? He asked. She shook her head. I was just missing our younger days, before we had to think about marriage and everything else. She bit her lip. It's ironic, isn't it, that I'm anxious to grow even older so that I reach the age of majority and my parents have less power over me? And yet I don't know if that will be enough. They won't be able to make demands or force me to marry, but if they can get me alone, they could still shut me in a carriage and send me off to Karnovka, and there would be little anyone could do about it. Will I always have to look over my shoulder? If they send you to Karnovka, I'll come after you, Sawell promised rashly. Alari looked up at that, her eyes blazing with something Sawell couldn't identify. Riding after the carriage like some hero of old? He laughed. I suppose. It might create an international incident, but I'll just claim to be desperately in love with you and unable to bear losing you. Nobody would dare deny true love, after all. It would look terrible to the people. His face was warm again at the words, and he couldn't quite meet Alari's eyes. He had spouted off nonsense to make her laugh, but once it was out of his mouth, he found himself deeply agitated, his stomach churning with discomfort. Shoving himself to his feet and barely remembering to duck before he hit the ceiling, Sawell turned to peer out the window. I had better be getting back, he said, making a show of brushing off his trousers. I do need to change for dinner, or my stepmother will have my head. Larry was standing in the doorway almost before he finished his sentence. Of course, I should too. I don't want anyone to wonder where I am. Goodbye, Saul. He bowed in her direction. Larry. But as he took the long path back towards the palace, he still felt as if he had said something terribly wrong. Chapter 3. Larry worked quickly, striking the flint against steel to light the tinder, then adjusting the kindling so it would catch. She was late. Nesta had not been happy to discover that she had not been cleaning all the grates daily, and had given her strict orders. Start sooner, work faster, and do not stop until every grate was thoroughly cleaned and every fire lit. This was the last one downstairs in the public rooms, and she was frantic to finish. The royals and courtiers would be using these rooms at any moment, and she needed to head upstairs to clean the bedroom grates while their inhabitants were gone. A noise at the door made her freeze for a moment. Then she grabbed her supplies and raced towards the servants' door, darting inside just in time. Too cold, a young woman's voice complained, just as Larry had the door shut to a crack. It will warm quickly. The voice was familiar, and Larry smiled to recognize Saul. She softly lowered her pail and bucket of supplies and peeked back through the crack. Saul had entered with a diminutive girl on his arms. She was pretty, with flashing dark eyes and high cheekbones, her hair in rows of braids that swooped over her forehead in a fashionable style. Behind Saul and the unfamiliar girl were two of Saul's brothers, Archer and Podrick, with their old friend Atilda on Archer's arm. Hiltrude, Kinned, and Griffin brought up the rear. Larry ached to join them. They were her friends, too. Well, maybe Hiltrude more than the others, but she had been friendly with them all in former years. But her parents had stopped bringing her to the palace so often in the past few years. The girl clung like a limpet to Saul's arm. I'll just stay close to you until the room warms, the girl said with a theatrical shiver. It's so cold, but you just seem to exude heat. Perhaps it's because you are so muscular. Saul looked as if he wanted to shake her off like a dog divesting itself of water after a fall into the pond, and Larry hid a grin. I had best check on the fire, then. I'm surprised the maids didn't stay to make sure it caught properly. Larry bit her lip. She would normally have made sure the fire was thriving before leaving, but Nesta had threatened her with dire consequences if she were seen by any of the royals or their guests. Oh, let Podrick check the fire, the girl said quickly. Why don't we sit together? She had not let go of his arm, even though she hardly needed his support to stand still in a room. Archer looked amused, and Podrick appeared to be hiding a grin as he went to stir the fire. Heat rose in Larry's chest as she watched the girl do everything but flutter her eyelashes at Saul. Did she know how ridiculous she looked? Poor Saul to have to put up with such ridiculousness. And she was leaning against him, her arm wrapped around him and her chest pressed indecorously against his bicep. Larry hadn't been so physically close to Saul since they were children, and they were best friends. Just who did this girl think she was to Saul? Rowena, Saul said at last, sliding his arm out of hers with a graceful movement that reminded Larry of his skill with the sword. I think you had better sit down closer to the fire. I'm a little too warm myself. Kinned snorted. Larry suddenly realized how long she had been watching the group, and she slowly and silently closed the door the rest of the way. She had many more grates to clean, and wasting time watching Saul and their friends, and this new girl, would not help get her work done. If she hadn't been in hiding, she would have been one of the group in that room. If the girl, Rowena, had persisted in making a fool of herself, Larry could have distracted her or taken Saul's other arm, if he had even offered his arm to Rowena in the first place. Larry paused in front of the back stairway, an odd feeling churning in her stomach. Was she jealous? Sawul neared the edge of the pond on his way to the little hut to meet Aleri. It was probably a little ridiculous of him to take a different route every evening, but he tried his best. Some days he left early and meandered around the pond for a while before disappearing into the woods. Other days he found his way through the garden maze first, or visited the ornamental flower beds. Aleri, he knew, didn't have as much time to spare, so it was safer for him to keep his walks looking more casual and varied, so that people would not connect the two of them disappearing into the woods at the same time. Just as he reached the tree line at the edge of the pond, he caught sight of something. Wild strawberries. Beautiful, ripe strawberries. He and Aleri had regularly gorged themselves on strawberries as children. They were a favorite of Aleri's, and of course, anything that allowed them to stay out in the woods longer and avoid returning for food was a benefit. On impulse, he crouched down and picked a few plump berries. If only he had a basket or something. He frowned down at his white lawn shirt. The strawberries would stain it horribly, but it was easily bleached. Without another thought, he loosened his cravat, unbuttoned his coat and vest, and untucked his shirt. Then he folded up the front of his shirt to make a pouch and started to collect as many as he could. But the shirt was fitted and would only hold so many strawberries while he still wore it, and it was a real challenge to keep them from tumbling too far to the sides and falling or risking stains to his vest and coat, which would be impossible to clean. With a sigh, he held the strawberries in one hand while shrugging off his other garments with the other, then switched. At least he was out of sight of the palace, and he had never seen anybody else in these woods except Aleri. She wouldn't mind seeing his bare chest. He had taken off his shirt a few times before, after all, and it would be worth it for the ripe fruit. He removed his shirt last, holding the strawberries carefully so that they didn't burst as he removed it. Now he had a proper basket. Sawul reached for a juicy berry and drew back with a gasp at a sudden sharp pain on his forearm. Careful examination of the next bush revealed stinging nettle plants growing between and amidst the strawberry plants. It would be impossible to pick many berries without getting thoroughly stung. Trying to avoid the stinging nettles was an exercise in futility with the plants so entangled. Well, Sawul knew from experience that the sting of nettles was a short-lived pain. It would be worth it to see Aleri's delight when she saw the load of strawberries. In fact, he had better pick quickly if he wanted to have the berries ready at the hut when she arrived. He redoubled his efforts, ignoring the nettles as best he could, so he could fill his improvised basket. He did let out a hiss when he turned to reach towards a new plant and accidentally leaned into a nettle, stinging his side just above the waist. "What are you doing?" Aleri's voice almost made him drop the berries. Wincing, he stood and turned slowly, attempting to hide his full shirt behind his back. "You are here early," he said. "I was hoping to be back at the hut before you got here." "I am not early." Aleri's eyes twinkled. "You, sir, are late." Sawul could not reach into his pocket for his watch. Besides, he'd discarded his coat on the ground somewhere near the first strawberry plants. But looking up, he realized by the evening light that it was indeed far later than he had guessed. He shifted the surprise behind his back, hoping she hadn't glimpsed them. But Aleri's eyes were not on what he concealed. She was staring at his bare chest, and her cheeks were as red as the strawberries. Maybe removing his shirt had not been the wisest thing after all. Why are you... what's... Aleri stopped, her face still red as her eyes skittered away from his chest. Oh, she wasn't bothered by the sight. In fact, it seemed quite the opposite. Sawul grinned and subtly flexed his chest muscles before he pulled out his surprise. "Strawberries!" Aleri exclaimed. "Oh, so that's where your shirt..." She frowned. "Sawul, what's this?" He followed her gaze to see the irritated skin on his forearms, where the nettles had stung him repeatedly. "It's nothing. There were some stinging nettles hiding among the strawberries." Her eyes widened. "And you kept picking them?" "It was worth the sting." Sawol lifted the pouch of strawberries. Let's go back to the hut to enjoy our feast. Not until we've treated those stings. Alari's warm hand stroked his forearm. The hair rose on his arm at her touch, leaving him with a tingling feeling as she pulled away. Come on. Sawol followed her blindly, caught up in wonder over that odd sensation. Since when did Alari's touch leave his body tingling and longing for something? Before he could explore the idea further, there was a wet slap on his arm. Sawol looked down to see her smoothing a handful of mud over the stings. What are you— Mud, Alari said, grinning up at him slyly. It helps cool the sting. It did, surprisingly. I'm not sure which is worse, the sting or the mud, he said honestly. You expect me to return to the palace with mud all over my arm? Before he could pull away, she was rubbing cool mud on his other forearm as well. You may want to enter through the kitchen, she admitted. Or you could rinse off in the pond first. Did you get stung anywhere else? Oh, yes, going in to dress for dinner dripping wet will be better. Hey! Alari had ducked under his gesturing arm to slap mud against the stings on his side. He glared down at her just as she looked up, bright eyes twinkling, and he froze in place. She was tucked practically under his arm in a surprisingly intimate position, and with her upturned face so close to his, he felt the sudden urge to kiss her. Sawol? Alari whispered. Sawol! A voice called from somewhere beyond the woods. Sawol? It was his younger sister, Marin. Stepping back and releasing Alari, Sawol looked at himself with amusement. He was bare-chested, arms and chest covered in mud, his shirt stained red and full of strawberries. You had better keep that as an explanation for why you aren't properly dressed. Alari gestured towards his shirt. I will admit I had not fully thought this out. He gazed ruefully at the strawberries. But they are meant for you. I would offer my apron, but I don't think the laundry maids would appreciate a mere housemaid making extra work for them. And if anyone notices that we both have berry-stained clothes on the same day, that settled it. I'll leave you with the shirt. And return shirtless? Alari laughed. Every girl you walk past will get the view of a lifetime. Now it was Sawol's turn to redden. But there's no need. It's not so far to the hut. You could leave them there. Much as Sawol had been looking forward to enjoying them with Alari, that would have to be enough. Very well. He hated to leave them on the ground after all the effort he had made to keep them clean while picking them, but she could always wash them before eating. But when they reached the hut, he found that Alari, too, had managed a surprise. You can put them right on the mat, she said proudly. I had a few minutes after you left yesterday. She had woven some of the wider grasses into a little mat that sat just inside the front door. It would be a shame to ruin it, though. I don't want to stain it. Sawol! Marin called again. Alari laughed. The strawberry juice will make a natural dye, and we can have a pink mat. I'll save a strawberry or two at the end to make sure the color is even. Now go, before your sister comes this way and finds the hut. I'd hate to waste the bribe I gave her to summon you so that I could keep all the strawberries to myself. For one startled moment, Sawol blinked at her before he laughed. It was with reluctance that he finally left Alari at the little hut, and after tidying his clothing as best he could, went to join his sister. I've been looking for you for ages, she said. Some dignitaries from Slana just arrived, and Father wants you to attend the meeting along with Rain. Sawol stifled a sigh. Very well. What were you doing? Marin looked over his shoulder towards the woods, then at his chest. The vest and coat hid the red stains, thankfully, but nothing could hide the overall rumpled condition of his clothes. Exploring. Marin grinned and shoved his chest. I can only imagine if I came back looking like that after exploring. Stepmother would have a conniption. You'd best take the back stairs up to your chamber and change before you let Father see you. His valet was unlikely to be pleased with the state of his clothing, between the red berry stains on the shirt and the mud on his arms and now sleeves. but pleasing Alary with the surprise of strawberries had been entirely worth it. Chapter 4. Alary smiled and shook her head as she approached the fireplace grate in the court enchanter's room. His room was always in disarray, and the fireplace was often full of burnt remains of herbs. Today was no exception. The ashes were liberally mixed with some sort of dried purple leaf. Once the hearth rug was rolled up and the canvas cloth laid out, Alary took out her shovel and pail and began to scoop ashes. As usual, the shovel kicked up a small cloud of ash particles into the air, and the room suddenly went dark around her. "Eva? Eva, get up!" Alary blinked blearily and sat up to see Nesta standing over her. She was smirking. "Fell asleep on the job, did you?" She kicked at Alary's foot. "I'll have to report this to the housekeeper, you know. I can't imagine she'll want to keep you on after this." In horror, Alary sat up so fast that she dislodged the scoop of ash in her shovel, making another ash cloud. For the second time, Alary found her eyelids drooping closed. When she woke again, she stared with confusion at the mantelpiece over the fireplace. Why was she lying down in a fireplace? Gingerly, she sat up. Was that Nesta? The head maid was lying on the canvas cloth, her arms and legs akimbo as if she'd fallen. What was going on? The room came into focus around her. The enchanter's work table was covered with leaves of some sort of bright purple plant, and the color jogged Alary's memory. The purple leaf remnants in the ash. The ash clouds that she had seen just before losing consciousness. "Ugh," Nesta said, rolling over and then sitting upright. "What?" Her eyes landed on Alary. "Why are we here?" "I'm cleaning the fireplace grate." Alary gestured, but didn't dare resume her work. A quick glance at the clock above the enchanter's table showed that only half an hour had gone by, but she couldn't lose her entire day in quarter-hour increments. Nesta frowned. "And?" Alary couldn't resist. "You came to talk to me and fell asleep." Before she could point to the ashes and explain, Nesta had stood up quickly. "Get back to work and don't dawdle. And don't ever let me catch you sleeping during your work again." Nesta flung her head as she opened the door and slammed it shut behind herself. Shaking her head, Alary eyed the fireplace with misgiving. What were those purple herbs? And how was she supposed to clean the ashes without falling asleep again? Was it breathing in the ash once it was in the air? Nesta had been near the fireplace, but not close enough to get any ash on herself, so that seemed most likely. Gingerly, Alary took her handkerchief out of her pocket and tied it around her nose and mouth. With great reluctance, she moved towards the fireplace for a third time and slowly began to scoop the ashes with the shovel. A small cloud of ash filled the air, but to Alary's relief, she was still awake. The handkerchief was enough, or at least it was as long as she was careful. The fireplace took her considerably longer than they usually did, given the care it took, and that, on top of her accidental naps, was going to mean a much later finish today than usual. When the job was done at last and Alary had put back the hearth rug and was ready to dump the ashes into the chute, she hesitated. What would happen to the ashes? Would she be sending anyone working near the base of the chute to sleep? What about later, when the ashes were collected from the bin? Perhaps she ought to find a better way to dispose of them, so that nobody was sent to sleep unsuspecting. It could be dangerous if the sleep happened at the wrong time. She felt only a little guilty rifling through the court enchanter's shelves looking for a closed container of some sort. After all, it was his failure to properly dispose of his herbs that had endangered both Nesta and herself, even if, in the end, nothing had happened worse than an unplanned sleep. Finding a box, she carefully scooped the ashes in. She had no desire to test how much ash her handkerchief could withstand. When she was finished, She was about to put the lid on the box when she hesitated. The palace offered an illusion of safety. While she was here, hidden as a maid, her parents didn't know where she was and couldn't demand her return. But if they discovered her location, they would be within their rights to take her away. She might only have one chance to escape. She didn't know how to use a knife or sword, and she didn't have magic. But maybe she could borrow a little magic. Taking down a bottle from the shelf, she carefully scooped some of the ash from the box before she shut it, then corked the bottle. It just fit in her pocket. Alary smiled to herself as she hefted the box into her arms for disposal into a safe area of the woods. She had a weapon, just in case. Alary? Alary looked up from where she was rubbing fire irons with oil to see Sowell peeking his head into the room. Sowell! She leaped to her feet and hurried to the door. What's wrong? Nothing. I just came to see you. Alary pulled him into the room and peered past him into the hallway. Thankfully, there was nobody about at this time of day. You can't just come to see me. I'm working. I see that. He looked towards the fireplace with a frown, then down at Alary's apron. She flushed. She had been cleaning grates all morning as usual, and her apron was covered with ash and soot. It had not contained itself to her apron either. Her dress was dirty, as were her arms, and she was fairly certain she had unthinkingly brushed hair away from her face earlier, probably leaving soot behind. And the soot had the unfortunate tendency to poof into the air as she cleaned, so even if she hadn't touched her face, it would probably be dirty. It wasn't as if Sowell hadn't seen her dirty 1,000 times, and she'd been the one to rub mud all over him the other day. Even remembering it made her face heat. It hadn't been until she had touched his bare side that she had realized what she was doing. She shouldn't be so embarrassed. It was only Sowell, after all. But when he'd shifted and his muscles had moved under her hands, she could have crawled under a rock and died. And then when he had looked down at her with heat in his eyes, she would be forever grateful to his sister for calling him just then, before she had done something even more humiliating, like kissing him. You shouldn't be here. It sounded like a scold, and maybe it was, just a little. Not that she could tell a prince what to do with his time. But this was a bedroom, even if it wasn't her bedroom. And if he were caught here with her? I know. Sowell held out something sheepishly. Alary watched with puzzlement as Sowell unfolded a white piece of cloth to reveal an apron. With a wicked grin, he flung it over his head and tied it around his waist. I'm ready, he announced. Put me to work. He was ridiculous. You know I can't do that. But Sowell was already dropping to his knees and reaching for the oilcloth. I'll work the grates while you do the fire irons, he said. When she didn't move, he bumped his shoulder against hers. Come on, Alary. It's not like I haven't done this before. You know old Perkins used to insist that we clean our own rooms when we were children. I may not have done it in years, but I haven't forgotten. Reluctantly, Alary took up another cloth and went back to her work on the fire irons, but she couldn't help a sideways glance at Sowell. What is it? She said at last, as she finished and took up the emery paper. What is what? What did you need to see me about? She scrubbed along the grate with the emery paper, hiding her wince at how it scraped on her hand. Nothing. She raised her eyebrows. Then, I just wanted to see you. It was a pleasant surprise to see him, too. Cleaning fireplaces all day was exhausting, dirty, and repetitive. But yesterday, her face heated at the memory of the look on his face just before Marin had called for him. For a moment, she had almost thought he was about to kiss her. Sowell, her best friend since they were small enough to hide in the grasses that grew along the banks of the pond. Why would Sowell want to kiss her? And why had she wanted to let him? She took a deep breath and kept her focus on her scouring until the heat in her cheeks could dissipate. The last thing she wanted was for Sowell to ask what was wrong. "Don't you have meetings to attend today?" she asked almost too sharply, regretting her tone in the next moment. She felt Sowell shrug more than she saw it. "There's a meeting later I should probably attend, but there are too many of us for anybody to know where we are every moment of the day. Which is probably how Artur and Cadwallon get away with so much mischief, come to think of it. I've heard stories. What would it be like to have 6 brothers and a sister, like Sowell did? Would they be protective and prevent her parents from trying to sacrifice her? Would they pull pranks on her? Her parents' house had always been so quiet. She had loved visiting the palace, but Sowell's siblings could be loud. Her favorite times had always been when she could be alone with Sowell, usually in the woods on the palace grounds. Although they had also occasionally escaped into the city together to buy sweets and visit the markets, blending in with the crowds so that they could, for once, pretend to be like any other children. Marin still hasn't forgiven them for putting a spider in her bed. One of those big, nasty, hairy ones, too. Her shriek was blood-curdling. Alary shivered. "I don't think I would have either. Poor Marin." Sowell leaned closer, and his warmth permeated Alary's shoulder as he brushed against her. "Not so poor Marin. She put the spider back in Cadwallon's bed. He might love pranks, but he isn't accustomed to somebody daring to prank him back." He chuckled. "His shriek was so loud that Rain came running. He wasn't happy, and Cadwallon got assigned to muck out the stables for a week." Alary smiled, although there was something odd about that. "Does your father mind Rain assigning punishments? Is that a privilege of the eldest?" Sowell's grin faded. "I suppose." He was silent for a moment. "Ever since father remarried, he's handed off more and more of his duties to Rain. He's still diligent, don't get me wrong. There's plenty of work to go around." Alary considered that as she took up a brush and the black lead. "I suppose that's the natural way of things. But what about you?" Sowell shrugged before taking the brush from her hand with a saucy grin. "I'm not sure he knows what to do with me, to be honest. Or with most of us. Only one of us can be king. Not many kings have 6 spares to determine positions for. And at the same time, he does need to make sure that if anything happened to Rain, I could step in. So he can't completely ignore me or assign me to some other position entirely." He brushed carefully, his eyes on his work. She took up one of the other brushes and joined in. "Probably you more than the others. It's unlikely who would ever be needed as the spare, I suppose," Alary mused. She had never considered the difficult position of having to spend one's lifetime prepared to step in if needed, knowing you probably never would. "It doesn't bother me," Sowell said. His hand brushed hers as they worked side by side. "I know that I will probably spend the next 20-odd years as Rain's right-hand man, until he has a son old enough for the position." He cleared his throat. "I love my brother, and I think Rain will make an excellent king. Better than I would. I suppose it's hard to figure out what to do when I'm right-hand man to the right-hand man. I don't want to overstep, but I don't want to neglect my duty either. It's easier for Artur, I think. He's free to join the palace guard as a 3rd son." He sighed. "I shouldn't be complaining to you when your parents decided your duty was to sacrifice you to a foreign king." Alary sat back on her heels, rubbing her brush into the tin of black lead. "Complain all you want. I don't mind. Besides, I think we're both in the same situation. If I were a man, I would be my parents' heir and the future earl." She crouched to begin brushing again. "Since I'm not, I'm useless to them except to bargain away in marriage or a lady-in-waiting. Neither of us have a clear position." She found herself suddenly aware of just how close Sowell's head was to hers as they worked side by side. He froze suddenly as if he, too, also felt the odd intimacy of the setting. Her breath hitched when he put his hand over hers. "Alary, Footsteps outside the door were the only warning they had. Sowell dove behind a low sofa just as the door opened, and Nesta stepped in, a triumphant smile on her face. The smile faded as she looked around the room. Then her gaze dropped to Aleri. "Why do you have two brushes out?" she asked, frowning. Aleri looked down at the brushes to buy a moment of time. Then she shrugged. "One for each hand. I find I can go faster that way, although my left gets sore more quickly." She picked up Sowell's discarded brush in her left and demonstrated, rubbing with alternating strokes. "I do the same with drawing," she said, keeping her eyes on her work and away from Nesta. If she looked up, she might give in to the compulsion to see if Sowell was truly concealed in his hiding place, and of course that would give him away entirely. "Very well, carry on." The head maid tossed her head and walked back out the door. Aleri continued to scrub for another minute, until she heard Sowell gingerly extricating himself from his hiding place. "How was that?" he asked, swiping at a bit of dust on his coat. "Pretty quick, don't you think?" Unable to contain her amusement, Aleri smirked. "You're very talented at dodging trouble. I suppose it comes from having 6 brothers. But you'd better get out of here just in case. You know I can't afford to lose my position." "Very well." To her surprise, he leaned over her and gave her forearm a light squeeze. "I'm sorry that I couldn't help more. Good luck, Elle." As he disappeared through the door, Aleri felt a tingle run down her arm from his soft touch. "How charming," a voice said. With a gasp, Aleri turned towards the opening servant's doorway. "I knew it," Nesta said, and the triumph was back on her face. "You're having a tryst with one of the palace guests." "They turned down my cousin for this position, only to hire a girl who flirts and has assignations with her betters. Well, that won't last for long once they find this out." Aleri's mind whirled in panic. How should she respond? Explain that he was an old friend? That would beg the question how a maid would be friends with a prince. Beg Nesta not to tell and promise not to see him again? Bluff her way out and dare her to report it? She couldn't afford anybody to connect her and Sowell. Wait. Nesta hadn't said prince. She had said palace guest. She hadn't recognized Sowell. It would still be a problem if she reported Aleri, as avoiding attention was crucial. But then, what did Nesta have to report anyway? "I cannot control which guests might enter and leave a room while I am working," Aleri said, careful to add a note of bitterness to her voice. "You know what nobles are like, always leaving their belongings here and there and having to come back to retrieve them." The head maid's gaze was on her. She could feel it, but she kept busy. The fireplace was finished, so she tossed the brushes into their box and began to roll up the canvas. "I'll find out who it is," Nesta said, just as Aleri stood with her supplies. "Don't think I won't. I promise you that I am not having any sort of affair with a palace guest." It was the truth, after all. Nesta let her go, but Aleri was tense as she walked past her with her equipment. She would have to tread carefully. Whether it was because Nesta had wished her cousin to be hired in Aleri's place, or whether she simply didn't think Aleri qualified for the job, she seemed determined to get rid of her. And Aleri was not about to lose the position. And her only way to stay in Cummer with Sowell. "Princess Clara of Slana turned 20 last week," Father said in a too casual tone. Sowell stifled a sigh. Breakfast was the only meal his family occasionally ate alone, and he had been looking forward to the peace that came from dining only with family and not being required to maintain the perfect posture, facial expressions, and behavior in front of Father's advisors, courtiers, and the like. But clearly, this breakfast was not going to be as peaceful as he liked. Not if Father was going to bring up marriage again. Rain reacted with only a curt nod as he kept his eyes on his breakfast. "She's a pretty girl, from what I've heard," and with 5 daughters, her father must be eager to marry them off, especially now that several have reached marriageable age. Arthur chuckled. And 2 of them already failed out of Raskra's princess contest, so he won't have competition to worry about. My dear, surely it is far too soon for any of your sons to worry about marriage, Queen Shyned said, her hand on father's arm. Her words were gentle and sweet, and her words should have been commendable. Rain was only 22 after all. But there was an odd firmness and intention to their stepmother's gesture that raised Sowell's hackles. Why wouldn't she want Rain to marry? If not Princess Clara, then perhaps the second daughter, Princess Esther. That might be a better choice, as King Imric has no sons and may pass the throne of Slanna to Clara's husband. You would not want to have to rule 2 countries so far apart. I have no wish to marry any of the Slannian princesses. Rain met Father's eyes briefly, before taking a forkful of vegetables. Father's face was turning redder than Sowell had ever seen it, no doubt in shock that his heir, who almost always followed his every command, was for once defying him. You know why you couldn't marry that girl, Father said in a low voice that Sowell had to lean forward to hear. I know. It's time you do your duty to the kingdom. Rain pushed away his plate and stood up. I'll marry when and whom I choose. His voice was quiet and firm. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps sure and unrushed. Father stared after him for a long moment. Had Rain ever defied him to this degree? But Father had been foolish to push him. While Sowell had no idea what had happened to Rain in Raskra, he knew there had been a broken engagement. Or perhaps Father had ended it before a formal engagement. He didn't know. But Father must realize that Rain would not so quickly be willing to enter another engagement. To Sowell's horror, Father's eyes flicked to him next. If Rain won't marry, then perhaps you should. Sowell blinked, but Queen Shyned broke in with a tinkling laugh before he could respond. Oh, Arnel, how silly. Sowell is far too young for marriage. But girls marry sooner, of course. Perhaps we should send Marin to the next princess contest in Raskra. Nobody was chosen in the first contest, perhaps because they're waiting for a true princess. She's too young, Sowell said quickly, glancing down the table at Marin. If he was too young for marriage at 20, it was ridiculous to think Marin was old enough at 16. Thankfully, she was seated far enough away and in deep conversation with Podrick, and had not heard Father's suggestion. Stepmother smiled. With all of the princesses from Slanna, there will be considerable competition for husbands in the coming years. And Marin's mother was from Raskra, so she would feel very comfortable there. Prince Rian of Raskra was some sort of distant cousin, and he was a decent man. He would make a good husband to someone, but Marin was so young. They need not marry right away if she is chosen, Father said thoughtfully. I'm sure King Owen would agree to a betrothal for a year or 2. His eyes rested on Sowell. Still, I should like to see you and Rain wed. Oh, Marin, dear, Queen Shyned called down the table, catching his sister's attention. Your father and I have been thinking of sending you to the princess contest in Raskra. Sowell winced as Marin looked back at them, eyes wide with shock. She would do as the queen ordered. Poor Marin missed their mother so desperately that she was eager to please their stepmother. But Queen Shyned always seemed determined to find every fault in her. If the queen sent her to Raskra, she would go. And neither father nor his stepmother had ever taken any of Sowell's advice to heart. His only consolation was that Ruskra was far friendlier and safer than Karnovka. Marin would be safe there, and if she lost the test, at worst, she would simply return home to her family. If she won, then Sawol would argue hard for father's plan to delay their betrothal for a year or two. But she would ultimately have a good husband who was a distant relation and whose country bordered their own. If only Aleri had such decent options. He could have sent her to Ruskra from the start, if he had the means, and it wouldn't have been too difficult for her to find a job and a safe place to live. But he would never have seen her again. She would likely find a husband there, and the very idea made his stomach twist. Because he loved her. Sawol sat back in his chair, stunned at the realization. It was so obvious that he couldn't believe how it had eluded him so far, and yet it was so earth-shattering that it was a wonder people around him couldn't detect that his entire world had been tilted on its axis. He loved Aleri, not just as his childhood best friend and playmate, but as his true best friend, partner, and the woman he wanted to marry. If he married Aleri, she would be safe. Her parents could not interfere or send her away, and he knew his brothers and probably his father would welcome her eagerly. What Queen Shined would say, he didn't know. She didn't seem as eager as his father for him and Rain to marry, but her true thoughts were hidden. But Aleri wasn't of age yet. Her parents could interfere if he and Aleri announced an engagement. That was, if Aleri was willing to marry him. She loved him, he knew, as a friend. But could she love him as a husband? Taking in a deep breath, Sawol closed his eyes. The only way to find out would be to ask her, and risk ruining what they had. But if she did, maybe they could have something beautiful. Chapter 5. Aleri's fingers hurt. There was so much soot jammed into her fingernails that she doubted they would ever be clean again. Her knees hurt from kneeling on the hearth, and her back ached from leaning over the fireplace. Closing her eyes, she took a deep breath. She was safe in Kummer instead of courting danger in Karnovka. She could see Sawol every day. Hard work was good for the soul, or something like that. Her parents could not take her away or sell her for their own schemes. She should be grateful. And she was grateful. If only grateful didn't have quite so many greats in it. She glared at the fireplace grate and then sighed and got back to work. Everywhere. Now that... Aleri dropped the scouring paper and stifled a gasp. That voice, passing by in the hallway outside, it sounded exactly like her father's. Impossible. But was it? Her parents must have made some effort to find her. Little as they might care for her personally, they would want her back to complete their agreement with Karnovka. They might not think to look at the palace first, but eventually they might remember her friendship with Sawol and come to the palace. While her parents had never paid much attention to her friendships and might not realize how close she and Sawol still were, they likely remembered at least a little from their younger days. She scuttled out of the room through the servants' door and into the dark hallway that led between the rooms. She had to know. If it truly was her parents, she would need to be prepared to avoid them, if they would even recognize her in her servant's garb. Guessing their direction, she raced silently down the servants' hallway to the entrance to a parlor farther down the wing. When she reached it, she opened the door just a crack and peeked into the parlor. Empty, thank goodness. Did she dare cross the parlor to the hallway door? Was there any chance that this parlor was her parents' destination? No. Of course, if they were walking this way so early in the day, they must have an audience with the king and queen. Hoping she wasn't wrong, Aleri crossed the parlor and pressed her ear against the wall. Nothing. She dared to open the door a sliver, just enough to look down the hallway. And there they were. Her parents, in full court costume, strode down the hallway as if they belonged there. Well, as nobles perhaps they did, but it still irritated Alary to see them so confident in a place she considered hers. She didn't dare shut the door and risk drawing their attention, so she waited until they had paraded themselves down the hallway before she shut the door and hurried back into the servants' hallway. From there, she would make her way through the hidden passages of the palace to the throne room. There was one servant's entrance to the throne room, which stood at the very back of the room and was meant for bringing in firewood to light the massive fireplace that dominated the back wall. Firewood, of course, being far too unsightly for the eyes of the noble courtiers and the commoners who came to petition the king and queen, so racks of firewood lined the walls of a hidden chamber that was connected to the system of servants' hallways. Opening the door as far as she dared, she strained her ears to hear the discussion happening at the far end of the throne room. "Here," Father was saying. "We have summoned him," the king said. "He will be here soon, and we will clear this up." They must be talking about Saul. Alary winced at the thought. She hated putting Saul in the position of having to lie to his parents. Saul must have heard about her parents' arrival before his parents had even issued the summons, though. For a moment later, a footman opened the door and announced, "Prince Saul." King Arnal raised his eyebrows. "Prompt as ever, my boy." "I aim to please." Saul glanced at Alary's parents, but did an admirable job of concealing any reaction. He turned to face the king, which meant Alary could no longer see his face. "What is this all about?" "You are hiding our daughter," Father said, moving as if to grab Saul's arm. A guard moved towards them before he could, however, and Father took a step back. "Hiding?" Saul asked. "Why would I hide your daughter?" "Because the fool girl doesn't know what's good for her, and she ran away." "Ran away? That doesn't sound like Alary at all. She'd risk her reputation, and for what? Had you arranged a marriage for her?" Mother and Father's heads turned towards each other, but Alary was too far away to see their exchanged glance. "Not a marriage, but she was to be a lady-in-waiting in a foreign court. Hardly anything shocking." "That sounds very reasonable," Saul said. "Which court? Roscra?" "It doesn't matter which court." Father's voice grew louder. "Where is she?" "I am afraid I don't know," Saul said. "Please," Mother said, her voice pleading. Alary bit her lip. She knew that voice. If you didn't know Mother, you might actually think she was near tears in her desperation. "Our daughter is missing, and we are desperate. Anything could have happened to her. We know you were her only friend. She would have gone to you. She must have told you something." "I haven't seen the lady in some time," Saul said, his voice cool, and Alary closed her eyes in relief. He hadn't fallen for Mother's manipulations. And he hadn't lied either. It had been some weeks since he had seen her as Lady Alary. Since then, she had been a mere servant and not a lady at all. Clever man. "Son," King Arnal said, his voice gruff, "if I have your room searched, will I find any sign that you are hiding Lady Alary?" "Of course not. I would never risk Lady Alary's reputation that way." "He could be hiding her elsewhere in the palace," Father said impatiently. The king chuckled. "In a palace full of courtiers, dignitaries, petitioners, and servants? I think that highly unlikely. Lord Royadder, I'm sorry that we couldn't help you." Mother and Father made the appropriate farewells, but as they turned towards Alary on their walk out of the room, she could see they weren't satisfied. They didn't speak until they were some distance from the king, though, and near Alary's hiding place. "We'll stay here for a while," Father was saying. "I don't believe that boy. He's lying. He must be. Who else would she have turned to?" "He might have helped her get away to Roscraw or Ashendune." Mother's voice was fading as they approached the door. "If he did—" A footman opened the door for them, and then they were through and gone. Alary closed the door softly, but she stopped to lean on one of the firewood racks. Her parents were staying at the palace. What was she going to do? "My dear, surely there is no great need for Rain to marry so soon," Queen Shined said soothingly. "Let him have his fun for a few more years. There will be time enough for responsibility." Sowell hid a snort behind his napkin. Rain? Fun? He already was as responsible as an eldest son could get, at least aside from the marriage question. Father nodded at Sowell. "But you will come of age in a few months. We could certainly consider negotiations for your marriage." "Surely not," stepmother protested. "He's a boy." "You want to marry off Marin, and I'm 4 years older," he reminded his stepmother. Now that he'd realized he wanted to marry Alary, he couldn't risk Father declaring he was too young. "We could have a ball to introduce him to the ladies at court." Father stroked his chin. "He may not be the eldest son, but there will still be a clamor to meet him. We can invite all the young noble ladies of the kingdom." Sowell sucked in a quick breath as the idea struck. He knew how to free Alary from her parents. But the timing would be everything. "That's brilliant, Father." Sowell congratulated him. "I would be thrilled to meet all of the nobles and their pretty daughters." In fact, I have absolute confidence that I will meet just the right young lady at the ball." Sowell smiled brightly. "In fact, I have an even better idea. I could marry her at the ball. We could arrange for a priest to be on hand. All of the nobles would already be on hand, and it would be the crowning moment of the ball. Perhaps just after midnight." Father's face was so red, he looked as if he were having an apoplexy. "Now see here. I don't appreciate your sarcasm." "I'm not being sarcastic," Sowell retorted truthfully. "I am perfectly willing to marry a noble girl at the ball, as long as she is of my choice. Isn't that what you want?" "You see, even Sowell is trying to point out the ridiculousness of this ball to find a bride," Queen Shined said, her voice smooth as silk. "Your line is secure 7 times over, my dear. And perhaps," she blushed charmingly, "perhaps it will even be 8 someday. There is no need to rush Sowell or Rain." Sowell cocked his head. Was that why she wasn't eager for him or his brothers to marry? Because that would push any sons of hers further down the line of succession? But that was ridiculous. He was already 8th. It was practically impossible that a son of hers would ever inherit. She would be better off considering a political or perhaps military career for any children. And she didn't even have children yet. "Yes," Father said, clapping Sowell on the shoulder. "I did not mean to push you, boy. I want you to start considering marriage. But there is no need to be precipitous." "I was perfectly serious," Sowell said. "But I have no intention of being precipitous. I won't marry a young woman unless I know her well and am certain she will make the perfect princess." Father sat back, satisfied. "Excellent, excellent." Sowell grinned across the table at Arthur, who raised his eyebrows in return. Father might think he had thought better of it, but wedding Alary at the ball was the perfect solution. It was too public for her parents to protest, even if they persisted in hanging around the palace. The public would love it, which would prevent his parents from wishing to intercede. And once he and Alary were married, she would be safe. Now he just had to convince her that she loved him and wanted to marry him. O'Leary dumped her cleaning tools onto a pail and stood, stretching her sore muscles. It was the end of the day at last. There was no more time to clean any more grates, as the guests of the palace would soon be returning to their rooms to dress for dinner and would not want a servant still there cleaning. Yawning, she stepped into the servants' passage and froze when she realized she wasn't alone. She dropped her pails just as a man put one hand over her mouth and another around her waist. "It's just me," Sowell whispered against her cheek. "Sowell," she hissed. "What are you doing? Trying to scare me to death?" "Hardly." He released her. "I wanted to warn you. Your parents are here," she finished. "I saw them. Well, I heard them first. I followed them to the throne room." She nudged his shoulder. "I was truly impressed at your ability to avoid answering their questions without lying." He grinned down at her, eyes shining in the dim light. "Were you now?" "But they're staying at the palace." She bit her lip. "I suppose there's no way to send them away." Sowell put his arm around her and pulled her in, and O'Leary found a warmth rise in her cheeks when he pressed her against his side. "I have a plan," he said softly, "but we need to be even more careful. I wouldn't put it past them to have me watched. I don't know if I dare meet you outside." "If this is an attempt to have me meet you in your bedroom, my answer is no," she teased. "You even promised your father, after all." He chuckled. "We could still try to meet outside. I could enlist a brother or two or Marin to help if we wanted. Or, is there a place we could speak privately in the servants' areas?" "Not many," she admitted. "Certainly not downstairs. Between the kitchens and the workrooms, one can never count on privacy. I would be in trouble if I brought you up to the servants' quarters, even during the day. But," she considered, "I rarely run across people in some of the servants' passages. They are only used when we need to go from room to room and avoid being seen. This time of day, most of the servants are in the kitchens, preparing the meal or preparing to serve it, or they are helping the royals and guests to dress for dinner." "So nobody is likely to come across us here?" O'Leary nodded. "What is it?" Sowell took her hand and led her towards the firewood racks. Some of the wood was stacked at the bottom, and he guided her to take a seat on a log and sat across from her. "My father wants to plan a ball to introduce me to the noble ladies of the kingdom." O'Leary's heart leapt to her throat. "He wants you to marry?" "Not immediately." Sowell seemed to be hiding a smile. In fact, he emphasized that. "But, O'Leary, you're a noble lady. You're the daughter of an earl." "So, you want me to attend the ball?" The thought of watching Sowell dance with all of the eligible young ladies in the kingdom made her nauseous. Why would she want to subject herself to that? "Yes," he confirmed. Then he did the strangest thing of all. He reached between them and took her hand in his. She let him, puzzled. It wasn't as if they had never held hands before, but not for years. To her shock, he brought it to his mouth and kissed the back of her hand. She yanked it back without thinking, half rising from her seat on the logs. "Sowell, what are you doing?" "Going about this all wrong, it seems." He sighed and gestured for her to sit down, too. "I want you to attend the ball as my guest. And at the ball, I want to present you as the young lady who has won my heart." O'Leary's heart raced, and she felt the oddest lightness in her chest, even as she couldn't catch her breath. "You—" She could manage no more. "O'Leary, I love you." He laughed, a joyous sound that sent thrills down her spine. "I can't believe it's taken me so long to realize it, but I can't bear the thought of losing you. Not because you are my friend and I care about you, but because I want you by my side, as my wife. I want to take care of you, share everything with you, and be your best friend, but also the father of your children." She blushed hard at that, but Sowell took her hand in his again. and this time she made no attempt to take it back. Will you marry me? I hope you enjoyed listening to Unmasked Part 1 by Sarah Carlisle, narrated by Karyne Norton. If you want to read more by Sarah, go to author-sarahcarlisle.com to find more of her books. If you can't wait until next week for the end of this story, you can sign up for her newsletter to get your own ebook copy of Unmasked. You can also check out the rest of the books in her Enchanted Tales of Tyr, starting with Tested, A Princess and the Pea retelling, which is available on Amazon. We still have the Fantasy Retelling audiobook giveaway running this month, with 4 fantastic retellings, plus a 3-month Audible subscription. If you want a chance to win, go to findingfantasyreads.com/giveaway to enter. And while you're waiting to see if you win, you can start listening to my serialized audiobook for Blood of the Stars. I've posted 60 chapters so far, which is 2/3 of the novel and almost 20 hours of free listening time. If you enjoy listening to Pater and me narrate stories on this podcast, I think there's a good chance you'll enjoy listening to my audiobook as well. You can find it on all the same podcasting platforms under Blood of the Stars, or you can listen on my website at karynnorton.com/audio. I'll also have easy links in the show notes. Thank you all for listening, and happy reading.